Engaging the public with financial transparency live at the Think Institute in Montgomery County. My name is Joshua New, and I'm a policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation, a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. The center is devoted to educating federal and state policymakers about the public, about the opportunities to pave the way for data-driven information. So Montgomery County's 2012 Open Data Act requires all county departments to curate and publish their data sets online. In December 2014, Montgomery County created Spending Montgomery, a website to help those interested in how the county spends its money access this information. Today we'll talk about the development of Spending Montgomery and the ways government officials can engage their citizens in increased and effective transparency. On this panel, we're happy to have Hans Riemer, councilman on the Montgomery County City Council, Victoria Lewis, the Data Montgomery project manager, Karen Hawkins, the Chief Operating Officer of the Montgomery County Department of Finance, and Ari Hafnung, the Senior Advisor and former Deputy Comptroller of Socrata. So if you're watching online, feel free to ask questions via the GoToWebinar, and they'll be addressed in a blog following the webinar. So Victoria, let's talk about Spending Montgomery. What is it and what does it do? Why did you decide to take this on instead of just simply publishing this data online?
So we started publishing spending data on our Data Montgomery site as early as 2012. And although we were making best efforts to update our data, one of our frustrations is that we're observing that few people were actually looking at the spending data. So after some internal considerations and talking to the public, we realized that we had two real issues. One was that we needed to provide more detail for our spending data. And the second one was that the data was too hard to understand in a data set or spreadsheet format. So the people that we were trying to reach to engage with weren't using our data. So we had formed a development partnership with Socrata to provide a guided view to our financial data. And our goal really was to be able to provide sites that help explain our data without the need for financial expertise. So our first success was last year's Budget Montgomery, where we provided a guided view of our operating and capital budgets. So this time around, we wanted to use those same efforts to provide a guided view of our spending data, which ended up being Spending Montgomery. So this is a site that provides a holistic view of how we spend public funds. It shows who's spending money, the types of things that we're spending money on, and who we do business with. And it's created in a very graphical way where people can search to find answers to questions that they have, and provided timelines and drill down capabilities. It provides detail down to the check level, and you can even find information on programs such as how much we're spending on snow removal for the snow outside. So we really did this so that we could really expand the base of the types of people that were looking at our spending data to encourage some conversations that we felt that we needed to have.
Great. Hans, how did this process start?
Well, when we first started talking about open government and open data, we were trying to kind of understand all the different pathways to pursue. And I fielded a request from some of the civic activists in the community for something that would provide financial transparency. Not a surprise that these activists wanted that information. They are the folks who are following us very closely, and when there is a tax increase proposed, they're on top of that situation. They're looking into how particular departments might spend their money. They want to know who we contract with. But what we want as government officials is an engaged resident community around open data, open government. So it seemed to me we should respond to that. So I started to look into what other tools were out there, what other governments were doing. And I asked during our budget time, is when I kind of get my real leverage over our budget officials, and I asked our Director of Management and Budget, to develop something. I pointed her to what was kind of a best practice in the field, which was New York City's, the comptroller's office there had an open checkbook. And so she started to look into it, and then, kind of came back to me and said, it took a long time, maybe a year or two later, came back and said, look, we think we can do something even bigger and even more valuable, because with the passage of the Open Data Act, we now have this data out there. We have a very comprehensive data set in a very raw format that we can build upon. And then, you know, from there, we got open budget, and now we have open spending. And it's really a remarkable tool. The depth of transparency for financial information in the county and for any government that wants to use it, I think is really unparalleled.
Great. Karen, what are your goals, and how does Spending Montgomery help you meet those goals?
Our goals for the project and in implementing Spending Montgomery were very consistent with what you've already heard from Victoria and Hans. We wanted to do three primary things. We wanted to promote a better understanding of spending data. To do that, we wanted to make sure we were trying to present all of our spending data, a total picture. And we wanted to really have a visual focus so that it was more user-friendly for any of the constituents that would be wanting to get at that data. Second, we wanted to improve access. We wanted to provide guided views, you've heard mentioned earlier. We wanted to provide different ways to get at the data. We wanted to be able to, users to be able to sort and to filter in different ways. We wanted users to be able to drill down from a very high level to a very detailed level. Victoria had mentioned the detailed check level and the invoice level. And we wanted to provide users to be able to take different paths down to that detailed level from the different places they might start. Our third key objective was to increase interaction. We wanted to provide data that was responsive to a lot of the Freedom of Information Act requests that we get in the Department of Finance, and for example, a lot of vendor inquiries that we get. So those were the goals that we had at the outset, and we structured both the project and the application to meet those objectives.
Great. Victoria, how did you engage the public in this process?
So when we initially got the request to create this financial transparency suite, we really wanted to hear what the public wanted and not necessarily guess from a government perspective what people wanted to see. So we had a roundtable discussion with people that kind of fit the mold of the types of audiences we were hoping to reach. And that included developers, advocacy organizations, and residents. And we asked them the types of questions that they wanted answers to. And from that, we really were forming an idea on the types of data that we should be showing from a spending perspective and how we should be representing it. So that really helped us form the strategy of the types of things that Spending Montgomery should be able to achieve. And then after that, once we worked with Socrata to create the prototype, we then brought in people that represented the types of audiences that we're going to use again. So the residents, the advocates, and the developers to come in and from an open lab perspective to check out the site. So we wanted to see if they could easily use the site without a lot of guidance. If they really needed any type of financial expertise to use the site, and if they were able to find the answers to those questions without any guidance from us. So the feedback we got from those sessions, we used quite a bit of it to form the final version of Spending Montgomery. So we really relied on the public a lot.
Great. Karen, can you talk about the challenges that you faced during the process of getting this tool up and running?
Absolutely. One of the first challenges Victoria just mentioned, and that was getting at defining what data people wanted to see. And when we talked amongst ourselves, we were finance officials and finance folks, and we had a finance perspective. We weren't coming up with the same answers when we asked our users and the constituents what they wanted to see and how they wanted to see it. So that was the first challenge, was really getting at the data that people wanted to see, determining how we would pull that data from our financial system, scrubbing the data, cleansing it, testing it, that type of thing. A significant challenge we had relating to the data was the topic of confidential and sensitive data. We knew that we had some confidential and sensitive data that was in the data set that the users would want to see that we could not publish. So for example, Montgomery County is a full service government. We provide public safety, police, and corrections and fire services, libraries, recreation, mass transit and highway services. But we provide a lot of services in public safety and health and human services. And for example, we have payments where the vendor is receiving social service payments. They only receive social service payments because they meet income eligibility requirements. So we knew we could not disclose those vendor names. through engagement with our operating departments who run the programs, we also came across some new surprises that we didn't anticipate from the beginning. There was additional data that those people in the departments that run the programs and know the data best was highlighted to be confidential and sensitive. So, for example, there are invoice numbers that could incorporate people's names receiving confidential payments. We have a women's shelter where the address of the women's shelter, for example, might be incorporated into an invoice number. So the using departments that ran the programs really knew their data best. We operate on a decentralized payment method, and so those departments not only know their programs, they know what they're putting into the payment transactions. So in that challenge, we really engaged the departments. We brought them and their attorneys to the table to look closely at their data and all the fields of data that we were planning to disclose in order to determine if there were additional laws that they were subject to that would preclude the release of that data. In addition to that, one of the challenges we had was managing users' expectations about what data was and was not included. So from a confidentiality perspective, we have an about page that discloses what is scrambled. And we made a policy decision to include all the data, but to scramble the fields that were confidential. And that way, it met the user's objectives of getting the better total picture of all the spending. We also disclose in the About page some other pieces of information that get to users' expectations. Users wanted to see budget to actual information, and so we wanted to make sure they understood that what they're seeing is county spending to vendors. They're not necessarily seeing the total final picture of revenues, for example, and after those expenditures go through certain accounting reconciliations. So this is vendor spending.
Great. Ari, and then Hans, if you want to follow up with a council perspective. What's the reaction been to spending Montgomery? What's your reaction?
Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here back in Montgomery County with my friends and colleagues here. I actually started working with Montgomery County while I was still Deputy Controller in New York City. So I'm now working wearing my Socrata hat, but we've been talking and working together and dreaming together for quite some time now. So it's delightful to be back. I've been thinking about financial transparency and what it means to taxpayers, government, to society for about 5 years now. First for New York City, and now really for governments of all sizes as senior advisor to Socrata. And I can tell you with complete sincerity that Montgomery County is really on the cutting edge nationally of financial transparency, and that's because of these good people here and all the hard work that they've done. So it's truly great to be here. Look, what we're talking about on a macro level is something that exists in New York City, Montgomery County, and all over this country, which is taxpayers fundamentally believe on some level that their hard-earned money is being wasted. That's what we're talking about. Taxpayers believe that their hard-earned money is being wasted. And when you look at studies like Pew Research annually looks at trust in government, which is kind of a big thing to think about, trust in government. When you look at the trend in trust in government over the past 50 years, it's declined 50 points from the mid-70s zone to the 20-something zone now. And I think one of the reasons for the decline, there are many reasons, and it's way beyond the scope of this panel, but one of the reasons is that taxpayers feel a disconnect with government and they don't know how their money is being spent. And in fact, a couple years ago, there was a Gallup poll that asked Americans, how many cents on the dollar do you think is wasted by government? 51 cents was the average, 51 cents. Now, I spent 5 years working for government, and I'll be the last person to say there's absolutely no waste in government. I've also spent 15 plus years working in the private sector, and there's a lot of waste there as well. But the notion that there's 51 cents on a dollar is absolutely absurd. right? It's absolutely absurd. And I think one of the reasons people feel that, and even some reasonable people feel that, is they have little understanding of how government operates and how we spend our money. And in people's daily lives, they have access to so much information, whether it's weather, whether it's sports, whether it's finance, and they don't have the same level of access when it comes to budget. And that's what financial transparency is really about. That's what Spending Montgomery is really about. How do we bridge that divide between taxpayers and the public? And I think Montgomery County has assumed a leadership position in all of this.
Great. So nicely stated. I think that we're really just at the beginning stages of this, and it's such a promising use of open data. I hope that it'll build a culture of accountability by creating a culture of transparency, and that will lead to more trust, and it'll lead to better decisions. I mean, I think when a government or an organization knows that, you know, the basic information about its decisions are accessible to other people, that they feel more accountable for those decisions. And when they feel more accountable for those decisions, they're more rigorous about making them. They collect more information. You know, they are more judicious in how they listen to people's views. So for the county government to provide access to anything and everything, you know, I think it will, over time, first of all, I'm hopeful that it can help put the brakes in the future on sort of bubble dynamics in spending, and we've experienced those here in this county when some categories of spending might get out of control. At the same time, I think it can help build support for the spending that we do have, because people won't, you know, be able to accuse us of withholding information. And then when concerns are raised, we can address them, and then we can begin to have this kind of environment here where everyone knows that if there is a concern, you know, it's in the public arena, and the government will consider it and respond accordingly. Doesn't mean that we'll do exactly what people want. So, you know, I think that it will just build a smoother process for us. We'll get better results, and then the residents will be happier, and they'll be, you know, more confident that their government is responding to the public interest.
Great. And so as a follow-up, that was how the government's reacting to Spending Montgomery. How might this engage citizens better?
Well, I think that, you know, I get a lot of questions from people about how we spend money. So now they can sit at their own computer or use their mobile device and, you know, get that information and then hold me accountable for it. So again, I think we're sort of at the beginning of the use of the product. You know, it's going to take a while for people to kind of understand how to use it, but I'll just give you the corollary with our budget tool. You know, you no longer have a paper budget in the county. You know, if you want to know how we spend money, you don't have to download a PDF document and print it up. You can actually use your display to get that information. I'm optimistic that we will begin to field inquiries about our spending, and then people could say, hey, you're not spending enough money on tree maintenance. You know, we're following this pattern, and we think you should be doing things differently. Or, you know, we get inquiries about a sidewalk and what vendor, you know, fixed that sidewalk and whether they did a good job or not. Well, if people are able to find out accurate information about what vendor that really is, then they can help us hold our vendors more accountable for providing good services. So they can help me be a better advocate, you know, as an elected official who needs to respond to the residents by helping me understand what's happening.
Great. So Victoria and then Ari, if you want to follow up, why should other governments make this level of financial transparency a priority?
So I know that when I approached Department of Finance to talk about doing something like Spending Montgomery, we had a lot of discussions on, you know, what we wanted the future to look like and why should we do something like this rather than just expanding how we're publishing our spending data. And I think there were a lot of benefits to creating a site like this, and there were costs that you could really think about of, you know, the cost of not doing a site like this. And like Councilman Reamer was mentioning, having people guess or have these assumptions about how we spend money can be dangerous. And if we can provide the facts where people can make their discussions based on facts, then we can have a real conversation. Another thing I think for governments to think of is that a benefit to governments is that if you publish your spending data according to these spending app standards, we're really starting to create a trend of having a data standard out there. And data standards are just so important for governments to be able to adhere to, so that somebody could look at our spending data and our neighboring counties' spending data and really have some good comparisons of seeing apples to apples for spending. And people like the stat teams out there nationwide can really take advantage of looking at trends in spending, or to come up with some things that they may not have been able to do when they're looking at, you know, how somebody publishes spending and the next person does it completely differently. So you can use these data standards between governments and actually within your government to help have good conversations. The other big plus that I think is a benefit for launching something like this is a site that was designed for audiences for people that have little to no financial expertise. So if you think of the advocates or like the really involved people that work with you, think of that growing exponentially, that you're providing a way to explain this complex data in a way that you can bring more people to the table to have these discussions. So really using a site like this to broaden the base of who you can talk to, I think is a really important thing for governments to consider when they're doing something like this.
Great. And then Ari, maybe if you wanted to comment from some of your experiences in New York.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, you know, we've spoken about this a few minutes ago. To me, it's about rebuilding trust between the public and government. And when governments talk about and debate should they become financially transparent, what are the benefits? There are many benefits, and I'll talk about a few. But fundamentally, I think the main answer is because it's the right thing to do, right? The data does not belong to government. The data belongs to the people, and governments are the custodians of the data, but data belongs to the people. And you know, we're sitting in this beautiful courthouse, and I don't know if the folks on the webinar get a sense of the space that we're in. We're in this red brick courthouse, I think we call it. This beautiful building was built in 1891, okay? In 1891, they may not have used the term financial transparency, but there's certainly a need to communicate to the public how public funds were being spent. And in all likelihood, there was some report. It may have been a verbal report to the council of the time, but there was some report. Fast forward 120-something plus years, we now have tools that they just didn't have then, okay? So there's been an evolution in financial reporting. A couple decades ago, we started the CAFRs, right? Certainly every government official knows what a CAFR is. Most people on the street have no idea what a CAFR is. And that speaks, it's a comprehensive annual financial report, that speaks to the disconnect that still exists between the public and government. And being financially transparent bridges that divide. And there's also an issue of cost savings, and Hans spoke about this. When government officials know that their decisions are going to be put in the domain, public domain for scrutiny, those decisions are better. Now, I remember my boss in New York City, the controller, always used to stop me and say, you know, how much have we saved from financial transparency? I want a number. He was a very quantitative guy. He was a trained actuary, and he wanted a number. And I tried all sorts of calculations, but I really struggled to put an exact number, a precise number. And then I reflected on that, and I realized that the biggest savings in financial transparency has to do with human psychology. And time and again, it's proven that when humans are being watched, when their actions are being observed, they act differently. We act just a little bit better. So asking to quantify the full savings, and you can certainly quantify savings from less FOIL requests, but the full savings is something complicated to do because you're being asked to quantify things that didn't happen because of financial transparency. Now let's take Montgomery County's 2015 budget, and Karen knows this better than I do. It's in the $5 billion zone? 4 to 5. Let's call it 5 between friends, right? $5 billion zone. Imagine you're able to save 1% for making better decisions. That's $50 million, 1%. Now let's say people say, whoa, 1%, that's too much. You know, there's no way you save 1%. Let's move the decimal, okay? 0.1%. Instead of 50 million, you'd save $5 million. What a great investment. What a great return on investment. So that's the pitch I make to governments of all sizes across the country about financial transparency, and that's why people are watching what Montgomery County is doing and adopting the same practices throughout the country.
Great. So Spending Montgomery is young. It was launched in December of last year. So Karen, what factors will make you consider this a success? When will we know that this has achieved its goal?
Well, I think the first factors already do allow us to know that it's a success. And the first factors I would point to are that we were able to achieve the goals that we set out with from the beginning. So when I mentioned earlier promoting understanding, we were able to pull in all of our spending data. That includes our purchasing card or credit card transactions, and it includes not only the bills that individuals pay and process one by one, but we have a number of payments that come in by interface, so in a whole group electronically together, and we've been able to incorporate all that data. We have a visual focus, and I think Victoria was alluding to it earlier. You can see data through numbers, through bar charts, through timelines. You can manipulate and sort that in a different way. So we've achieved, with the initial implementation, promoting understanding, improving access. We have both guided views, and we have the ability to download the raw data, and we post the raw data. So we not only have the ability to use this application, but people can get at all the underlying detailed transactions. We were able to structure this so that different users coming in from a different perspective can start at a different top-level place and drill down. Victoria talked about who spends the money. It's which department, which organization in county government. What do they spend it on? What are the types of expenditures we're incurring? And who are we spending it with? Who are the vendors that we are paying? From the third perspective, it was increasing interaction. So we have incorporated data that is responsive to the types of Freedom of Information Act requests we get. We get requests relating to purchasing card transactions, and we have included that data. We get requests relating to what's called abandoned property or uncashed checks. So unlike a lot of the other sites that we saw out there, we include the status of individual checks, whether they've been cashed by the bank or not. And we've included information that will help vendors from their perspective, where their bills paid. If you go beyond that, I would look at the people using the site, and in a very short period of time, we have had as a percentage more people looking at this site over the last 2 months than the last 4 years of data that we provided, which is at a very summary level. It was mentioned earlier. Over time, it will reduce, the comment was made, streamlining the time it takes us to respond to requests. But I would also share a recent experience. Montgomery County has delegations that come in from other countries to visit us and to learn about our financial policies and procedures because we are known for them. And just last week, we had a delegation come in from another country, and it's really amazing to watch folks who, they're sitting back, they're listening, but when we provided a demonstration of Spending Montgomery and the type of data that we were making available to our public, to watch folks lean in and lean past the person in front of them and talk back and forth in their own language, and then the smiles like, wow, we can't believe you're actually providing, this data. Wow, we could apply this over here. Wow, if we could do this in our government. And awesome, amazing, incredible. Those were some of the adjectives that were used at the end of it. I haven't been part of a delegation like that before. I haven't had that kind of reaction. So those are just, sharing some recent experiences that get to the feedback we've had about its success.
Great. And then one final question, and this is for all panelists. I'll go down the line. But Ari, you mentioned that this puts Montgomery County at the cutting edge of financial transparency. What advice might you have for other governments trying to mimic this success or to take the next steps towards more transparent government?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, there are a lot of folks on this webinar really from across the country, and I don't want people to feel like, oh, you know, here's a guy from New York City. New York City has a $75 billion budget, and Montgomery County, while it's a smaller budget, $5 billion is also a pretty sizable budget, and that may lead folks to think, you know, it's only for the big guys. Financial transparency is just too complicated, it's too expensive for a town or a village of our size. And a couple years ago, that was fairly accurate. In 2010, when we started building checkbooknyc.com, check it out if you haven't seen it. I love that site, but I am biased. We weren't faced with a build or buy decision because there were no other products on the marketplace that offered these features and functionality. So we were faced with, we're going to build it or we ain't going to have it. And we decided to build it. And it cost us $3 to $4 million to build. And we had the financial resources and the political will to do it. And I'm proud to have been part of that initiative. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that there are somewhere in the zone of 100,000 governmental entities in this country. And many of them are really small. But now, organizations like Socrata are offering very similar tools at a fraction of the cost that it cost New York City to initially develop. So I'm really excited about the ability of governments of all sizes now to adopt the best practices that they're seeing in places like New York, like Montgomery County. Everybody can do it. Taxpayers in any size town want to know how their money is being spent.
Karen, if you each wanted to respond.
Sure. I would just say from a lessons kind of learned perspective that having the right sponsorship at the top and the right folks involved early, I would say that if you are operating in any form of a decentralized environment, you know, individual folks run their programs, talk to them early and get them involved. We talked to our folks, but we could have done it earlier. So those are some of the feedbacks that I would provide.
Victoria?
I would say the thing that I would say for advice would be to really think about why you'd want to do a site like this. I don't think, you know, when you form your team, to do it to check off a box is one thing, but if you can really talk to the public and talk to the people that you feel like you already engage with on financial data or that you want to engage with on financial data, that you should really involve them in the process and come up with a really clear vision of what you're trying to achieve. You know, this is now productized, so it's something that other governments can use and adapt to, but you're still going to have some conversations on the scope of the data that you want to show and how you want to approach it and how you're going to communicate a tool like this to the public. So I think really investing the time to come up with your real ultimate goals and not just necessarily just wanting to do it just to do it, I think is really important to think about.
Well, it all starts with open data. That's really the piece that I would want to communicate most forcefully because you know, we passed the Open Data Act of 2012 towards the end of 2012. And, you know, specific implementations were not, they were only sort of imagined. But here we are 3 years later with, you know, another groundbreaking use of open data. This is going to continue, and other governments will also be part of this community of governments that are providing new services and you know, new benefits using open data. But when I got started in this area, you know, my first question was, well, I hear everyone's doing a hackathon. how can we do a hackathon? And then I realized that in order to do a hackathon, you have to have data. And so once you realize you have to have data to do anything interesting, then you have to build the foundation in your government to create and publish the data. So we passed a law that requires the entire government, gradually over time, to produce open data sets. And then each part of the government will figure out, I hope, over time, a groundbreaking innovation, to use that data. Here we have budget and financial information being provided in what I think is a game-changing kind of way. Hopefully next year we'll have another webinar about the new use of data from the environmental side or the transportation side.
Great. So I'll just like to open this up to any closing remarks that any of you might have if we didn't cover anything that you wanted to address. No? All right. So for anyone watching online, feel free to ask any questions and they'll be answered in blog format after this webinar. So I'd like to thank all our panelists for joining us. I'd like to thank the Think Institute for hosting us, and thanks for watching.